Greetings all and welcome back to another video on 1/72nd scale Messerschmitt Bf109s. Today we will be building the Academy 1/72nd scale kit of the Bf109 G-6. I'll leave a little link in the description to Tectonic Hobbies where you can buy this kit and many others, but without further ado, let's get into building this one. Assembly for this kit begins in the cockpit. There are 3 pieces that go together to make up the floor, and then you have an instrument panel with raised details and 2 fuselage halves. I sanded some of the excess fuselage flashing off with a hobby knife before cutting out the trim tab wheels and gluing them to the fuselage halves. I added some extra detail by using some spare plastic sprue and some copper wire to make the oxygen and the fuel tank systems. After that, I painted the interior of the aircraft 2 coats of Tamiya XF22 RLM grey and glued the instrument panel in place. I put together the tail sections and the wings while waiting for the 2 coats of paint to dry. There was a little bit of flashing on the parts, but I could remove it all pretty easily with a file. I used a small needle to drill out the holes for the fuel tank on the underside of the wings. The wings fitted together pretty well, however one downfall of the Academy kit is its recessed panel lines are pretty shallow, so I used my Tamiya scribing tool for the first time and carved out the lines to make them a little bit more defined. The results were much better than the original kit, but still a little bit messy. I used a fine brush to apply some extra detailing to the interior in the form of some XF3 flat yellow on the fuel lines, XF18 medium blue on the oxygen tank systems, XF64 red-brown on the cover for the joystick, and a bit of XF1 flat black, XF2 white, and some Vallejo vermilion red for the instruments and details. The instrument panel had some raised details, but unfortunately no decals were included in this kit for the instrument panel, so I chose to paint all of the dials by hand. For some of the very fine details, I'd use a needle to apply the paint. I gave the cockpit a little bit of character and weathering by applying some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium, again with the fine brush, onto various panels and surfaces in the cockpit to create a little bit of metal chipping. After it had dried, I then applied some Tamiya panel liner scent in black to the various parts of the cockpit to highlight details and make them look a little bit weathered and grungy. The 2 fuselage halves came together really well and the fit was good. I then glued on the wings and the tail section once the 2 fuselage halves had dried together. I cut out and then sanded the upper section of the cowling with the machine guns and then glued it to the rest of the fuselage. The fit for this part was okay, but unfortunately at this stage I discovered I'd accidentally knocked off the small part that holds the propeller. I tried to glue it back on, but unfortunately it would prove too flimsy to hold the propeller in the end. I glued on the last few extra parts for the aircraft, including its elevators, and also built the landing gear and attached it to the aircraft. All these parts fitted well together, however I think the landing gear on the Academy 109 is a little bit underscaled. I decided to leave all the fine antennas off and glue them on after painting to avoid knocking them off as I paint the model, but I did apply the tail wheel, the landing gear, and the exhausts and the exhaust shrouds. I made an attempt at getting the propeller to go together and still spin, however unfortunately the weakened structure that holds the propeller to the fuselage that I broke off and had to re-glue was not strong enough to hold the propeller in place. So in the end I had to just use a bit of blue tack to hold the propeller to the fuselage. Finally, I added a little bit of putty to fill in some of the gaps between the fuselage halves and the wings, and also to try and soften the exaggerated tread pattern on the wheels of the Academy kit. Once the putty had dried overnight, I sanded it back and rescored any recessed panel lines with a sharp hobby knife. I painted initially 4 coats of RLM 76 version 1 by AK Interactive on the underside and also the upper side of the wings, since I was doing an Eastern Front aircraft which had a little bit of RLM 76 on the upper surface of the wings. I apply the paint, thinning it down with a bit of water and trying to apply it in the same direction as air would flow over the aircraft. This is to keep the brush strokes nice and uniform and help make them less visible. I painted a coat of RLM 75 on the upper surface, trying to apply an outline for the camouflage before filling it in. Once again, I keep my coats of paint pretty thin and also make sure to try and apply it in the same direction as much as possible. The main key to making sure you don't end up with thick lines and paint streaks is to keep your layers thin. It's better to do lots of tiny layers of paint that slowly build up to form the colour that you're looking for, rather than one thick sloppy one. The other colour featured in this camouflage scheme was a little bit of RLM74, which I applied to the upper surface and also stippled a couple of small sections on the side of the fuselage to help create the mottling. I then applied a second coat of RLM75 where I'd painted it previously, and also applied a few little small dots on the side of the fuselage with it. I then softened the effect of the mottling by applying a coat of RLM76 over the top, making sure to keep it thin so you can just see the RLM75 and 74 stipples underneath. This creates the illusion of airbrush and helps recreate mottling using a brush. After I'd applied a second coat of RLM74 and 75, I then painted the yellow markings using some Tamiya XF3 flat yellow, again keeping the coats nice and thin to avoid brush strokes. Once the camouflage had fully dried, I then applied my decals. To apply decals, I simply put them in water for a few seconds and then let them dry, and then I apply them onto the model using a wet brush. I'll then move them into position using a brush, or in some cases my finger, or carefully a sharp hobby knife. There were a fair few decals, including some nice common stencils, and overall the quality of the Academy decals is really good. I didn't experience any tearing, and as you'll see there wasn't really any silvering to complain of either. After I'd applied all the decals, I then dabbed some Tamiya decal adhesive onto them to help them conform to the surface of the model to highlight details and adhere better to the kit. With the camouflage done, I neatened up any mistakes using some XF22 RLM grey on the landing gear and around the cockpit, and then I painted the landing gear, machine guns and nav lights XF16, and the exhausts were painted X31 Titan Gold. I glued the canopy in position along with some of the small aerials and painted them RLM 74 or 75 depending on their position. For the canopy frames, I use a very fine brush and very carefully apply the paint, and afterwards, as you'll see, I neaten up any mistakes I make with a cocktail stick. I painted the rubber for the tyres XF1 flat black and the inside hub for the wheel X1 gloss black for a bit of contrast. With the paint job complete, I move on to the weathering process. First of all, I do a little bit of metal chipping by getting some flat aluminium and a fine brush and applying the flat aluminium onto areas such as the leading edges of the wings, the propeller blades, and any areas where crewmen would walk or any access hatches that are likely to get scratched when opened and closed. I make sure the paint is relatively dry when I apply it so that it doesn't flow too much into the gaps and instead looks more like metal scratches. Once the metal chipping is dried, I apply some panel liner onto the exhaust to create some exhaust streaking, and also between the control surfaces and the various recessed panel lines on the aircraft to highlight them and make the aircraft look a little bit dirty. After applying the panel liner, I then remove the excess with a cotton bud. Sometimes I'll drag the cotton bud back in the direction of the airflow to create some streaks. After the panel liner has dried, I then apply a little bit of Tamiya enamel thinners to remove the excess and to thin down some of the areas to make the weathering look a little bit more realistic and toned down. After this had dried, I then applied some Tamiya weathering powders. I began by applying, using a brush, a little bit of black behind the exhausts, around the areas where the guns are, and I tried to streak it back a little from the landing gear to create things such as exhaust smoke, gun smoke, and a little bit of oil leaking out. I also used a little bit of the rust colour to create some of the coolant leaks from the radiator, and finally I painted on the nav lights using some Tamiya clear red and clear green, and with that the model was finally completed. So overall, my opinion on this kit is it's a little bit old and lacking in some details, and the landing gear is a little bit of an odd size. It seems a little bit too small for the rest of the aircraft. But overall, I still had a lot of fun. It went together really easily. There's a few nice little features. And once I'd made the panel lines a little bit more pronounced and done a little bit of weathering, I think I got a really nice kit out of it. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And special shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund my videos. You guys are wonderful people, and if you want to join my patrons and see exclusive content and help support my channel, be sure to check out my Patreon in the description of my video. And thank you very much for watching, and until the next video, model on!